Hello and welcome to the Waterstones podcast. My name is Will Rycroft, and this is a very special episode because it gives us a chance to speak to the authors who have just been announced on the shortlist of the Waterstones Debut Fiction Prize 2023. And this news is so hot off the press that they have only just found out themselves very recently who else is on the shortlist with them. So I'm not going to waste any time. I want to get straight into the conversation. But rather than me giving a sort of very boring introduction to each author, I'm going to ask the authors to introduce themselves and to distill all those years of hard work into a very short elevator pitch for each of their books. And in the spirit of fairness, I'm going to go alphabetically by first name. I should have prepared you for this, shouldn't I? But that means that Alice Wynne will be the one who gets things going. Alice, over to you.
Hi, my name is Alice Wynne. I wrote a book called In Memoriam. In Memoriam opens at this boarding school, this idyllic boarding school filled with sort of naive, smug, entitled, charming public school boys in 1914. And the two protagonists are called, sorry, I'm nervous, are called Henry Gaunt and Sidney Elwood. And they are very good friends, even though they are very different. So Henry Gaunt is a bit out of step with his own time. He's a little bit of a pacifist. He's a bit withdrawn, and he doesn't have very many friends. But Elwood, by contrast, is incredibly popular and very romantic. And both of them are secretly in love with each other. But because it's 1914, neither of them can express this to each other. And so they both think their love is unrequited. So then the war breaks out, World War I, and Elwood is incredibly excited by this, and Henry Gaunt is a little bit concerned. And they both end up going to the front to fight. And the question of the novel then changes, and instead of being a question of, will they, won't they, will they ever get on the same page and confess their love for each other, and the question changes instead and becomes one of, will either of these two young men survive?
Fantastic. See, I'm already gripped. The authors have probably been sitting there going, where am I going to be in this order of proceedings? But I can tell you that the next author we're going to hear from is Cecile.
Hi, everyone. So my book is called Wandering Souls. It's partly based on family history, and it follows three siblings, An, Tan, and Min, who leave Vietnam after the war in the late 70s, spent some time at a refugee camp in Hong Kong, and then finally settle in the UK during the sort of Margaret Thatcher era, which is a time of really big political and societal upheaval. And during the journey, they've lost their parents and four of their younger siblings to the sea in unknown circumstances. So the book is really about them trying to build new lives for themselves from scratch in this country they know almost nothing about, while also trying to deal with immense grief. And within that narration, there's also some kind of archival research and nonfiction elements and reflections on griefs and so on. And you hear from different voices. You hear from their little brother Dao, who's like speaking to them from a place in between the living and the dead. So yeah, that's my book.
Fantastic. Thank you, Cecile. And next we come to Colin, who was very close to coming second, but now you're third, Colin, because of that O. But over to you, please.
Cool. Cheers, Will. Thanks. I'm Colin. My book is called Carla, and Carla tells the story of a group of friends who we follow as teenagers and as adults, and the teenage and adult timelines are intertwined. So as teenagers, we're following them really over the course of, this kind of the summer of their lives. It's this time where they're passing through all these adolescent thresholds, like the first love, the first kiss, the first time getting drunk, all that kind of feverish, hormonal, giddy magic. And at the center of this group of friends is Carla. She's 15 years old. She's the leader of the group. She is their emotional core, the heartbeat, the kind of glue that's holding them all together. But the thing is that beneath every kind of smiling surface of this West Coast of Ireland tourist town, there's a broiling kind of darkness that's constantly threatening to swallow these characters. And as the summer goes on, they're getting closer and closer to that darkness. And by the end of the summer, Carla goes missing. So 15 years later, three of the surviving members of that original group of teenagers are thrown back together when human remains are found in the woods, and the past and the present begin to dramatically and violently collide. That's the elevator pitch for Carla anyway.
Thank you so much, Colin. And now I'm going to move over to Jacqueline.
My novel Fire Rush kicks off in the ghostly, underground, dub reggae world of 1970s London. It's the Black Sound Revolution, when drum and bass was weaponized against police brutality. Based on my life in that subterranean world, the story charts the journey of Yamei as she battles for control in that very male-dominated subculture. Waging her own revolution, she goes on the run from a gang that's been exploiting her, escaping to Jamaica, and that's where she connects with her family's past and history and prepares for the biggest fight for her survival.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jacqueline. And now I'm going to move over to Michael McGee. Michael, please tell us all about your book.
Hello, I'm Michael McGee. I've written a novel called Close to Home, and I guess it's about a young man, a young university graduate who returns home to Belfast from Liverpool. He sort of falls back into the world that he was trying to leave behind in some way. It's a world of people who haven't been to university like himself. He's kind of the only person in his family to have went, the only person amongst his group of friends who have gone. And in the time that he's been away, there's been this economic crash in 2008. And so there's this feeling that there's very little in the way of opportunities for jobs and whatnot when he returns. And he sort of falls back in with this crowd, and with that sort of falls back into old modes of behaviour, let's just say. Parties a lot, he drinks a lot, he takes some drugs. And one night at a house party, he gets into a bit of a argument with a guy, assaults him. And then the rest of the novel then is basically him sort of coming to terms with what he did while navigating a city that's sort of been hit pretty hard economically. And it still sort of carries this legacy of a 30-year conflict in the form of the Troubles, that he's sort of trying to put himself out from under. So,
fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Michael. And to complete our shortlist, I'm going to move now to Nana. Nana, please tell us all about your book.
First I'd just like to say I'm definitely not subconscious about the blandness of my background right now. I promise I also have access to a room with books and stuff, but I'm on the road right now. My book is called, my name is Nana Kwame J. Brunya. My book is called Chain Gang All-Stars. It's about an imagined future in which convicted wards of state can opt out of a sentence of at least 25 years and participate in death matches. The draw being that they survive 3 years on the circuit, 3 years as part of this blood sport. They're giving clemency. They're freed. And it particularly follows Loretta Thurwar, who is sort of the grand champion of these games, and her journey as she tries to figure out what her legacy will be in sort of the end of her tenure in this space. But it really ends up being a lot about the carceral state, about prisons, about the ethics of how to handle those who do harm, and our considerations about retribution. It really is a meditation on those things as much as anything else.
Fantastic. Well, as I said before we started recording, 6 books that are so different to each other, but that have all been highlighted by the Waterstones booksellers who love them. And as I say, this award is very much about putting the trust in them and their expert sort of opinions about books, and identifying the new voices that excite them most. And so I have asked them to submit questions for all of you. And the first of these is actually coming from a few booksellers, and it's sort of a group question for all. And that, of course, is that after you've done the years of work on your sort of early writing, you then have to hand it over to these so-called experts like agents and publishers and editors, and of course readers. And a lot of booksellers were wondering how you deal with what then follows when you hand over your baby to somebody else. And I'll keep the flow that we've got going. So Alice, I'm going to come to you first. How did that make you feel when you handed over your manuscript, first of all?
You know, with a name like Alice Wynne, I really could have come last if you'd just gone by number. For me, it's been really magical. So I started writing In Memoriam in 2019, I think, and I fell in love with these newspaper articles, these student papers from my old school, from during the period of the war, and I was procrastinating, and I ended up accidentally reading all the student papers during the war from like 1913 to 1919, and I became completely obsessed with these newspapers, and I was so alone in this obsession because they were incredibly sad. I mean, they were just the most devastating thing I've ever read because they were so raw. You know, it's these teenage boys writing obituaries for their older friends, their older brothers, you know, in the full knowledge, in the full expectation that they will soon be joining their dead siblings and friends at the very conflict that took their lives. So, you know, it was incredibly raw. And meanwhile, no one wanted to hear me talk about it. And like everyone was just like my friends made this like bingo sheet whenever I brought up the Great War. And my husband would be like, if it's going to be sad, I don't want to hear about it. And so it was actually very isolating. And so it's been, you know, really lovely to have people come up to me and be like, wow, you know, World War One is so sad. And I'm like, that's what I've been saying. I was in America as well, right, where World War One is sort of seen as this like niche, like the War of Jenkins' Ear or something. It's like this very niche war. So I was really isolated in it, and it was, it's been really magical having people kind of come and join me in this story that I was in all alone. So for me, like wholly positive.
That's fantastic. Well, that's very good to hear, because I can imagine it could be quite scary to hand over a text to somebody to look at. Cecile, I understand that you have some experience working within the publishing industry, so you know all too well what can happen when a manuscript gets handed over. How did you feel with yours?
Yeah, I think for me, by the time I submitted my book to agents, I was very much ready to kind of have it out of my hands. And especially because the story was so personal to me, I was really craving to have a bit more of an objective point of view, and someone who could kind of guide me a bit and give me a bit of feedback. So, and I think because I worked in publishing before, I worked at Vintage, where Anna and Jacqueline are getting published actually, I knew that not to take any feedback too personally. I knew that it was just part of the process. So I was really open to receiving editorial feedback. So for me, it was quite a joyous process, and it was also very interesting to see how different agents had very different opinions on the book. You know, you had some agents who really hated a character and wanted me to remove it. Some other agents wanted me to include more of that character, and so on. So it just kind of proved how personal and subjective reading can be. But it was really nice to be able to talk about the book after, like Alice, having spent so much time just writing it and just being on my own with the story and the characters. So it was a joyous time for me as well.
Oh, this is very good. I'm very pleased to hear that there's not sort of vomit-inducing anxiety for everybody. So this is great news. Colin, I'm going to come to you next. You have some experience as well with sort of publishing other authors in journals and stuff. But how about for you handing over your own manuscript?
Yeah, for me, it was all about the vomit-inducing panic, you know, from start to finish. I mean, it was, I'd already been working with my agent for a while, just like writing short stories and stuff. We'd kind of had a relationship, but so she was the only person that I was sharing any of the novel with when I was doing it, and it was actually quite productive for me. Like, I work very well with deadlines or something like that, so I would always kind of be like, okay, by this time I'm going to give you this much, and then by this point I'm going to give you the next part. And I really have, you know, I really trust her with my life, you know, like I trust her judgment on things very well. So that wasn't so bad sharing it off with her. But then when she submitted it to publishers, then definitely, you know, it was just constant tension, headaches, like blisters kind of on my gums, all this really, you know, really sexy stuff. So but yeah, you know, like that's kind of, I guess that's part and parcel of it. But yeah, like at the time of recording, you know, my novel still hasn't come out. It's being launched next week. So I'm kind of like, I'm talking to you like this, but it's like the duck gliding on the surface of the water. Underneath, there's just this frenzy, you know. So yeah, but that's the long and the short of it, basically. Yeah.
I wonder, actually, because of that, as you say, like because your book is yet to come out, so you're waiting for sort of reviews and things like that. Does something like this, where booksellers have clearly taken this book to their heart and absolutely love it, does something like that help maybe alleviate some of that anxiety?
I mean, yeah, like it means a huge amount, you know. I mean, it's really, yeah, it's fantastic. You know, I couldn't believe it when I was given the news. It's incredible. So that's definitely very heartening. You know, I think it's one of those weird things. I don't know if everyone else on the call would agree with me, but it's that kind of thing that, you know, it's almost like no matter how many reassurances you get, you know, they can always be outweighed by just the doubts that you have all the time. And on some level, I feel like maybe that's a prerequisite to being a writer in the first place, is you need to have some sort of self-flagellating impulse in there. Otherwise, you'd never inflict the torture of sitting for hours and years on end, So yeah, I don't know.
Jacqueline, your book Fire Rush was shortlisted for the Women's Prize. So this is your second prize you've been shortlisted for already. So you're probably just sort of super calm and cool about all this stuff. But what was it like before all of these accolades started to come your way?
I mean, I have been collaborating a lot in the 16 years that I've been writing this, collaborating with dancehall Jamaican dancers, dub reggae DJs, so showing my work. So sharing it with editors wasn't an issue, because I've been sharing it with just about anyone who will listen and give me some feedback and help me. So that was part of it. But yeah, it's really, the shortlisting for the Women's Prize and now this, it does make me feel a bit more, just a bit more confident about my book being out in the world.
And Michael, you've been a bookseller, so you know how that works. But of course, being a writer is a very different thing. And how was that sort of move for you, and how have you handled handing over your own work to people?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I don't know if I'm speaking for everyone here, but writing this novel certainly wasn't my first attempt at writing a novel. I tried to write 2 or 3 before, unsuccessfully. So I was well familiar with the concept of rejection, and had been rejected thoroughly through my 20s. And that sort of built up a thicker skin over time. And so when I came to writing this book, it took me a while to write it. I started writing in 2016. So, it was the right time in my life to write a book. I also had spent a long time writing it. So by the time it got to sharing it with, my agent was waiting on the sidelines essentially for me. When I showed it to her, I was kind of ready. I was kind of like, right, this is it. And when I knew, and it's kind of worked out pretty well for me, because my agent wanted to send the book out to publishers on the same week as my girlfriend's 30th birthday. So we took off to Paris. We just went. And it was glorious, It actually ruined the whole holiday anyway, because by the second day we got the first phone call. So it was a bit chaotic. It was a kind of very good way of just extracting myself out of being locked in a room and chewing the nails off myself. But from being a bookseller, I lucky I spent 2 years in Waterstones while I was writing a PhD, and it was 2 glorious years. I loved that job. Going from it was kind of lovely writing the book while I was working in a bookshop, and sort of getting the other side of how books are sold and all that kind of thing, But then when it happens, as Colin sort of alluded to there, I sort of felt that someone was pulling a very elaborate trick on me, I sort of couldn't, and even now I still doubt, I still sort of going, I think people are a bit deluded, or something's amiss here, But that's part and parcel of the trade,
Humility is a wonderful thing. I'd also like to point out that Michael has not been paid to say that he loved working as a bookseller at Waterstones. No money has changed. And then I'm going to come to you finally. Obviously, you've written stories, but a novel is a very different thing, as any writer will attest to. What was it like working on that, and then, as I say, handing it over for others to pass judgment on?
Yeah, it's been a journey. I would say that the novel, it felt like swimming with no shore in sight just for a very, very long time. It took me 7-ish years. And so when I finally showed it to someone for the first time, I was terrified. I think I'm always terrified. I showed it to my agent, who's my first reader, and a really smart reader, Meredith Capel-Simonoff. And yeah, I was really scared, because I didn't know if it made any sense at all, and it's like this thing you've been trying for years and years, maybe just totally not working. But then you turn in a book again and again and again. There's so many phases of turning in. It's the agent, then it's to the editor, and then to the editor again, and then in my case to the editor again, and eventually the copy editor. And I feel stressed out and nervous for every single one of those turning ins. I feel really raw and scared every single time. But that said, it's and maybe even beyond that raw and scared, it's like a letting go that I'm still experiencing. Like this thing that was just for you for a very long time becomes just for you and your agent, then you and your editor, and then you and the world, and eventually becomes more the world's than yours. And it's kind of like a melancholic. I know it sounds very like I'm painting like a bleak picture, but it's kind of a melancholic experience for me. That said, getting connected with people who eventually read it is amazing. But it's a letting go, and for me, it's a letting go of what has been the most consistent part of my life for almost a decade. And there is some like just a harshness there, but again, it's a gift to see the world receive what you are sort of letting go of.
That's really, really interesting. And thank you, all of you. There's some fascinating answers there for sort of the different experiences you've all had. Moving on, I think that one of the most common questions that we've had from booksellers, and this will often be the case, I think you'll find when you go to do events and speak to people, is that people are always interested to know about the inspiration behind books, and indeed the sort of the research or the work that you've done in order to create this piece of fiction. And what's really interesting, I think, is that in each of these books, you've all had very different experiences there. So, Alice, you mentioned earlier about those school newspapers that you discovered and sort of dived into. Could you tell us a little bit about sort of incorporating those into the novel, but also how you then develop an entire novel from something sort of so brief and real?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about these newspaper articles a lot, much more than I think anyone really wants to hear, is what I've discovered. But yeah, well, okay. So I've already I had read quite a lot of war literature, just generally. I think growing up in the UK, and I went to these kind of boarding schools, and they are sort of obsessed with World War One. And so, you get in just through the osmosis a certain amount of Siegfried Sassoon, although usually not in a gay way. They really they hide that one under the carpet. But and I think what I noticed was that war literature, it's usually written by people who have gone through this terrible trauma, and then they spend 10 years sort of processing it, and then they package it and they try to write it out. So, for instance, Robert Graves and Vera Brittain, they both talk about writing novels first, and then those novels just don't work, and they have to scrap the novels, and then they have to try writing instead memoirs. And sometimes in their memoirs, they'll have whole sections where they're like, here's just a passage from the original novel I wrote because it's better than what I'm going to. So they're very highly processed, these pieces of war literature. Usually, I mean, a lot of the best World War I literature came out in like 1929. And so what was unusual about these school newspapers is that they are so immediate. They are coming out like instantly as the war is going on. And unlike war literature, which is written by someone who went through a trauma, trying to explain what that was like to people who were not there, these newspapers are just for people going through the trauma to other people in that same circle with them. So you feel like a voyeur. You're watching it, and it's so raw and painful to. I mean, it's really painful to read. But it's sort of hard to describe how I felt reading it, and I really wanted to get that across. And so one of the key parts of the book is that these newspapers are throughout, and I lifted directly from the newspapers, and I kind of sort of chose the bits that I found most heartbreaking. And, for instance, one of the ways you'll have to try and find out if a character you like survived a battle is that you get the list of the dead in the school newspaper, and you scan the list of the dead, and you see, oh, he lived or he didn't live, or he's wounded, or I don't know what happened to him. And I just wanted to get across that feeling that I got, even just in this small way, when I would get attached to these people who I had read about. And for instance, Siegfried Sassoon had a brother called Hamo, and the only anecdote I know about Hamo Sassoon is that Sassoon once came out to him and told him, I prefer men, and Hamo just answered, well, me too. And so I remember this like shock I felt when I saw his name in the lists of the dead, and that was it, and then and like that name just jumped out of me at the list. I was just scanning the list, and this one name was so much more important than the others. And of course, every name is like that to someone, and I just wanted to get that feeling across. And that's only really the beginning of the research. I mean, there's the incredible thing about World War One, because I'm now reading a lot about the Crusades, and like it's a really alienating series of conflicts that it's really, really hard to get emotionally invested in a lot of ways. But with World War One, there's so much incredible literature. So it was really an incredible experience just to like really dive deep into that. But I've got to stop myself.
we do a spin-off podcast episode if you want, Alice, and you can go into full detail.
Let's talk about the war. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Cecile, I'm going to come to you now, because you too are sort of pulling from historical sources, if you like, but your own family's history, which of course throws up a completely different challenge to the writer. Could you tell us a little bit about that sort of research?
Sure, yes. So even though my mom also lost her parents and siblings during their journey, but my mom, she went to a camp in Thailand and then she went to France. So straight away I changed the setting, which I thought, both for my mental health was quite good, because it meant that I could sort of dissociate from my family story and the story I was trying to write. And I purposefully didn't ask my mom too many questions about her experience, because I did want the characters to not be based on her and on my uncles. But I think finding that balance and getting into that kind of mindset was quite hard at first, and I procrastinated a lot at first, and a lot of it was doing my own research and like Alice, like reading newspaper articles and National Archives and so on. So it took a while, and I felt a lot about the responsibility about writing about a true story in some ways, and writing about the Vietnamese boat people as well, and finding that balance between how much trauma should be in the book and how much hope. And so I was very aware of all those questions when I started writing the book, and finally I had to kind of just trust my instincts a bit, I think, because otherwise I would never have written the book. I actually can't even really remember writing the book, because it was such an intense kind of, I think I wrote the bulk of it in about 6 months, so it was a very intense process for me. But then I showed it to my family, and they were very gracious, and they really liked it, or so they say. So yeah.
This, I suppose, an element when you're writing about family history and you hand it over to them, that I guess you're wanting their sort of blessing, right? You want them to kind of go, yes, this is fine. You may take our lives and turn them into fiction.
Yeah, very much so. But I mean, most of my family doesn't speak English; they speak French. So the book's coming out in France in August. So that's another stress that's on my mind at the moment. But my mom did read the English version and was really happy about it.
Good. So you've had the first part of Judgement, and the rest is coming soon from
Exactly.
France. Good to know. Colin, I'm assuming with the plot of Carla that it's not connected to something that's happened in your real life, but I could be wrong. But the characters, I think, feel very real. So many people have commented about how it reminded them of their own sort of teenage years. And as you said, first love, first kiss, first drunken, whatever it might be. Could you tell us a little bit about where that inspiration came from and the work that you did in putting the plot together?
I mean, it was very incremental, I suppose, but it's kind of like I was reading a book recently that was about all these revolutions that happened in Europe in 1848, and it used a metaphor that I thought that's maybe the best metaphor for how the creative process works that I've ever come across. But he was actually describing the outbreak of revolution, and he was saying that it's not like something happened here and then something happened there, and you can kind of trace this linear line of how all of these things broke out. He said at a certain point, the process entered the fission stage, and there were just these simultaneous detonations occurring in multiple locations that had these weird subterranean connections with one another. But like he says, at this point, the historian despairs, and the only word that they can keep using is "meanwhile." And that's sort of what like the creative process was sort of like, in the sense of, I know that I need to come up with a very succinct, like, this is where it came from, but it was more like, it kind of went like that. And then there would be periods where you did feel like you were just pushing a boulder really slowly up a hill, but then you'd come over the top of the hill and then you were chasing after the boulder because everything was suddenly doing the again,
Yeah.
So it's not like I was doing necessarily research for anything in the novel per se, because it's much more, it's just embedded in the relationships of these characters. But I think that one of the things that I probably brought with me into the book is this idea of displacement or dislocation, because like Michael was mentioning earlier about, you know, the impact of the economic crash in Ireland, and there really is a whole generation of people, including my entire friend group, that basically was just shattered by that, and was scattered all around the world. And like most of us have never been back. You know, I've never lived in Ireland again. So that was something that I wasn't consciously thinking about that when I was writing the book. But of course, you know, you get to the end of it and then you realize the amount of displacement that there is within the characters, this kind of very ambivalent connection to home and things like that. And I think that that's something that probably a lot of people actually can respond to today, because of the fact that we are living these fairly deracinated lives a lot of the time. So, you know, I think on that's like on the adult level, and then of course on the teenage level, I think everybody, no matter what the content of your experience of being a teenager was, everyone has some sort of belly memory of the intense emotional voltage of those years, you know. So I kind of would, I don't know. So that was where it was coming from. But again, you know, more like fission explosions as opposed to a linear kind of process.
As you were talking about teenage memories there, all six of us were just like nodding our heads. Yep. Jacqueline, the underground world that you take us to in Fire Rush is sort of so specific, and it will lead many people to assume that the novel is at least semi-autobiographical. So my first question is that true? And if so, how do you sort of manage those very porous lines between fact and fiction?
I'm very much drawing on my lived experience. I was involved in the gang. I was exploited. I wrote the novel as a way of exploring my experiences, but also trying to understand the behaviour of those people in my life. And beyond that, I wanted to go back to the people I knew in that world. And I started to realise that I was actually writing about a lost world, because the dub reggae world took place underground, 12 midnight till 7 in the morning, out of sight of mainstream society. It is a lost world. And I got excited about trying to recreate that world. And in trying to bridge the gap between fact and fiction, you know, I think I'm working with memory, and memory is so unreliable. I start with the memory of my experiences and the people in that world. And then for me, fiction is a way of going deeper into understanding the motivations of people that were in my world. I think fiction for me is a much more powerful way of exploring human behavior. And so I start off with lived experience as a starting point, and fiction takes me beyond that into a deeper level of understanding.
That's really interesting. It's sort of almost connected to what Alice was saying earlier about the rich literature that surrounds the First World War is so much easier to connect to than the slightly dry historical sources that you might find about the Crusades. So that would leave a nice window for some more Crusade fiction, which I guess is what Alice is working on, but we'll find out. Michael, I'm going to come to you now, because similarly to Jacqueline, my understanding is that your early writing for Close to Home was much closer to memoir than it was to fiction. So could you tell us a little bit about how you take sort of memory and then what you need to do in order to sort of make that switch and turn it into a novel?
Yeah. Well, actually, the book started out as a writing exercise that a friend of mine suggested whenever I just started my a PhD in creative writing at Queen's in Belfast, and was sort of banging my head against the wall trying to figure out what to write. And I was saying that I was writing, but I just wasn't writing anything particularly worthwhile, and sort of writing the wrong thing. I don't really know how to. I was trying, and weirdly, it was the same world that I sort of ended up writing about, but I just couldn't get close enough to it. Or there was a reluctance in me to go too far into it. And I was probably trying to protect myself in some way, you know, it's a weird defense mechanism. And so he sort of suggested that I write a letter to the most intelligent person I know, it was him. His name's Tom Walsh. But he sort of said, do this, start at any point in your life and just go from there. The reason he actually suggested this is that he came up to Belfast. He lived in Dublin at the time, and we set up late drinking one night. And we had one of those nights, where friendships are made. We sort of told ourselves all about our lives and all our problems, And he was like, "You need to fucking write about this." It's like, right, okay. So we did, and so I started this letter, and I started at the point where the book started, and just went from there. And the letter just kept getting longer and longer, and over the course of about 3 or 4 months, I suddenly had like a draft or manuscript length piece of writing, which I had to print off. Oh, it sounds terrible. I had to print it off and sort of post it out to him, So it was almost to me like I'm burdening myself with all this stuff. And then he rang me a few days later and he said, "You know what this is, don't you?" And I said, "Yeah, I guess I do." But it was kind of highly confessional, sort of block of writing, but had a kind of narrative through it, and I was kind of using novelistic sort of mechanisms. I was using dialogue, and there were little scenes and sequences in that initial letter that found their way into later drafts, and which I sort of worked off. But then it became a process of like gauging distance, of taking myself out of it. The memoirs of form just didn't suit me. As Jacqueline said, like I felt I needed more freedom and that I needed space. And there was a brilliant essay that I've quoted more than once by Vivian Gornick in The Situation in the Story, and she sort of talks about like creating this narrative persona in order to get the right distance that you need from the material that you're writing about. And she uses that in terms of non-fiction, but I think it applies to fiction if you're using, your own experiences or whatnot, like, And so when that happened, and it was such a, it was weird little tricks. And I guess like so much of writing is sort of tricking yourself in certain ways and finding ways of doing things, and one of it was as simple as like changing the narrator's name, which in the early drafts he was called Mick, and then I changed his name to Sean, and that just sort of created. I was like, oh, he's not me anymore, and he was almost this other version of myself that could have existed but didn't, and so I sort of used that, and that sort of just opened things up in all sorts of ways, and allowed me to say things that I otherwise probably couldn't have within the realms of memoir, So but while also, having the joy of writing fiction and embedded in that, like,
fascinating. It's quite a gear shift to come to you now, Nana, because of course this sort of the imagined future that's contained within Chain Gang All Stars takes us into sort of dystopian territory. But I'm reminded of Margaret Atwood when she was talking about The Handmaid's Tale. She said, "I haven't made up anything in this book. Like at some point in human history, somewhere on the planet, all of these things have happened, and I've just put them into this story." Could you tell us a little bit about the inspiration behind Chain Gang All Stars and the research that is still required to create an imagined world like that?
Absolutely. I mean, a lot kind of went into me deciding to go down this road. I didn't ever really hope to have to do real research, and I did have to do that for this one. I think initially it came, my father was a criminal defense attorney when he was alive, and I remember the first time he told me that he was defending someone who had committed a murder, and I was probably like 10 or 11 or 12. And I remember thinking like, okay, well, my dad's a villain now, and then I don't know what I said, but something like, some kind of like protest. And I remember him telling me it's not that simple. And that's probably like a seed that got planted really, really, really early on. And when I'm in writing this book, I think I wanted to discover if I really believed some of the things I thought I believed, like in terms of abolition or changing the carceral state and changing prisons completely. And so I did research, and I discovered, that everything that I've created, there's a difference in kind, but not in the nature of things. I think that, or I know that at least the American carceral state is direct descendant of the slavery system. I know that like slavery is explicitly protected in the American Constitution. There's things like the Auburn system of prisons, which I cited in the book, where prisoners were forced into 24-hour silence and could never speak. And so the speculative aspect of the book or the things that I make up, the surrealist conceits, they're more just like a tool that I can manipulate to be both hyper specific or difficult to reduce. Yeah, it required a lot of research because the research and like the understanding of this carceral state in our real world actually was the foundation for, I don't know, like the heart behind what I was trying to get to, which is that it's really hard to be like, in this particular place we're going to have an institution founded on cruelty and suffering because people have caused suffering. Once you do that, it's really hard to contain that.
Thank you so much, Nana. I'm going to come to some more sort of individual questions now from our booksellers. And I'm afraid, Alice, I'm not going to mess with the flow. I'm coming to you first. This question comes from Gabby. And as we've mentioned, the novel is filled with a lot of emotion that you've been talking about, but it also has a lot of action, including a very exciting prison escape. And Gabby was wondering how you go about sort of getting the research right for something like a set piece like that, and how you sort of keep it accurate but also thrilling.
Well, the World War One prisoner of war escapes were just really thrilling. So the prisoner of war escape that one of the characters undergoes is based on the Holzminden escape, which was the kind of ultimate. It was the sort of first great escape. Like when we think about the Great Escape, we think of World War II, but the Holzminden prison escape was when these men dug a tunnel beneath, I can't remember if there was a moat or not in Holzminden. I think there wasn't. But anyway, they dug a tunnel and 10 of them escaped and got all the way back to the UK, which is incredible odds. And one of them got, the tunnel collapsed on him. And the character who there's a tunnel collapse in the book, and the guy in the tunnel is inspired directly by the guy who got stuck in the tunnel in the Holzminden prison escape, who was this British Indian pilot called Errol Chanda Sen. And yeah, really, the story is so incredible to begin with. And I think, in fact, there were so many cool things in these prisoner of war escape books that I couldn't use because I sent the manuscript to a lot of friends, like maybe 10 or 15 friends, and so they would scale me back. They'd be like, okay, this bit you just put in, like, it's interesting, but it reads like a Wikipedia article, like it's not relevant to the plot, and I'd have to like cut that back. But yeah, there was so much stuff I couldn't put in. Like there was this one guy who escaped he spoke pretty good German, and he just got on a train, and he was part of the tunnel escape. He dug his way out, and then he just took trains out of Germany, and just like whenever anyone spoke to him, he would just be a bit unfriendly and they'd leave him alone. But like his description of it is just terrifying, because like it'll happen that a bunch of German soldiers will get on the train, and he's just kind of like trying to look German. I don't know, it was just, and what's funny about the prisoner of war literature is that it's this sort of hilarious sideshow to the Western Front, because the Western Front, is like, it's just pretty much wall-to-wall bleakness. And then the rules of these prisoner of war camps they're like, it's like gentlemen's rules. So like, I'm talking about officer prisoner of war camps, because I'm pretty sure that if you were a private, you were just like sent to go build like walls in Siberia or something. It was bad. But for the officers, as long as they promised to not escape, they were allowed to go on little promenades through the town. And they wouldn't escape because they had given their word as an officer, and so they would just literally they'd go on little walks and like go to the shops, and so it's just madness. Really, really silly. So I really wanted to incorporate that, because it was something that it brought so much levity to the novel, but I also thought it was a really good way at examining sort of the classism and xenophobia, right? Because it's this thing that the officers are going through that is so different from how it would have been if they were not part of this ruling class. They would have been in the normal prisoner of war camps, and instead they get to basically be in like sort of gentlemanly sort of prisoner of war public school. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah, the action is all there in the original material.
Yeah. It certainly does answer the question, Alice. Thank you. Cecile, I'm going to come to you now. This is a question that came from Hope, and it actually came out of the discussion in the Shortlist panel, which was so many readers of your book had said about how they had found it very emotional to read. It had made them cry. And I'm a terrible person because I hardly ever cry when I'm reading stuff, and I'm highly suspicious of people who do. But presumably, when you're writing, is that thought in your mind? Are you thinking, I want to write something that's going to hit people right in the feels, or do you have to sort of distance yourself from that and just hope that the truth will have the emotional impact?
Yeah, no, I didn't write the book. I really want to make everyone cry, and I never really know quite what to say. If I should say like thank you or sorry when people come up to me and say you make me cry, but it's I'm really glad that the story resonated with people. But I think I just wanted to write kind of real characters and show the emotional resonance that this story can have on just an area of people on the three siblings, but also on you know there's a kind of a narrator as well in the book, which is kind of from the younger generation who's like writing in the present day. And I wanted to show how one event can affect kind of different people as well. But I think after a while, when writing the book, I got a bit numb by how sad the story was. And I was part of a writing group at the time, part of the London Writers Awards. And I had to ask my writing group, like, is this chapter too happy? Because I was like, there's one chapter where they see snow for the first time, and it's kind of one of the first moments in the book where they regress to the state of childhood, and you see them being joyful. And I was worried that it was just like too happy. And then my writing group was like, no, this is really sad. Like they've just lost their whole family, and like they're just being children again. So I think it was very helpful to have that feedback, to be able to get the balance right between not the book being too much of a sob, traumatic story, but also having some hope and some moments of happiness in it. Because I did want to get that balance right somehow.
Colin, I'm going to come to you next. And this is a question from one of our booksellers called Saba. She said that she loved the chapters that came from different perspectives of the different characters, and how each character was beautifully fleshed out, and it gave the reader that sort of chance to inhabit their world. But she wonders if there was ever a point when you considered doing a chapter from Carla's perspective.
Well, one of the inspirations structurally behind the book is there's an essay that Gay Talese wrote in the 1960s where he was trying to get an interview with Frank Sinatra. He was trying to interview Sinatra, and he kept on getting rebuffed by Sinatra's people. So every time he would ask for an interview, they'd say, "Oh, Mr. Sinatra has a cold." So he was talking to Sinatra's bodyguard, to the person whose job it was to look after Sinatra's toupee. He was talking to fans that would be camped out at Sinatra's hotel, things like that. And gradually he realized that this would be the material of the story. So I can't get a direct contact with Sinatra, but I can make this collage of voices, of perspectives surrounding Sinatra. And through that, I'm going to get this really fleshed out, multi-dimensional, multi-perspective image of the man. And what I really loved about that structurally is that it opens up all of these spaces where you have these contradictory viewpoints of Sinatra, and the reader is invited to enter the kind of the fissures that exist between those different perspectives in order to discern the real Sinatra that's existing somewhere between all of these images. And at the same time, the plurality of perspectives also captures the mercurial nature of what it is to actually be a person. So what when in terms of Carla, like the character of Carla Linan, in many ways she is, structurally speaking, she is the Sinatra of the novel, in the sense that she is an enigmatic presence, or a haunting absence that it conducts the entire novel. She is the book center of gravity. She's there on every page. She's determining every character's thoughts and actions. But at the same time, the reason that I wouldn't have given her a first person perspective thing is because what I really wanted was for you to have that space as a reader to try and actually get closer to Carla yourself by discerning who she was between the different representations that you're getting, not just from the three narrators, but from the voices of the local gossips, newspaper reports, all of these kinds of things. Because what I felt like is that if you left that space open for the reader, they would be entering the book and becoming creatively involved in the creation of Carla themselves,
That's fine. I had no idea that Sinatra was going to appear in this podcast, but it was great to have him here. And it gives me a really, really dodgy segue now to move over to Jacqueline to talk about music, because, of course, one of the things with Fire Rush is the rhythm of the language. And I was lucky enough to sit in on the sort of panel discussion for the shortlist, and everybody was talking about the rhythm of the prose and this sort of pulse that it gives the reading. Can you tell us, Jacqueline, a little bit about how on earth you go about creating a style like that?
For me, the what I want to do, I set myself the challenge of bringing music into the word somehow, and I felt it was important writing about the Black Sound Revolution to have a language of music somehow. I didn't know how I was going to go about it, but I thought, hey, I'm just going to experiment and try and find my way. So I wrote lots of short stories, experimenting with sound and language. I spoke to musicians, but also using Jamaican patois and dub reggae sound effects was my way into trying to find a language that could represent the Black Sound Revolution and also the artistry and the kind of revolutionary intonation of Jamaican vernacular. So it was really important to me. I think that was the driving force behind writing this was to kind of highlight the artistry of Jamaican or Caribbean language and the sound effects of dub reggae that have come out of Jamaica.
That's fascinating. It's so good to hear because, as I say, everybody who has read that book has had the same response to it, which is that it's not like anything else they've read because it has this unique rhythm to it. And of course, for some readers, they might slip into that really easily. Others will find it more challenging. But the challenge is all part of the job, right? That's sort of what you're trying to do, is to give voice to something which is underrepresented. Would that be a fair?
It was definitely about championing the vernacular, whether that of any community, any marginalised community. I believe strongly in voice and that every language, every vernacular has its value, and it shouldn't always be, standard English that is, looked up to as high culture. So it was me kind of having my own mini revolution on the page.
Michael, as we mentioned, you were a Waterstones bookseller, and just to reiterate once again, no money has changed hands; everything is completely above board. But I did wonder whether, that experience that you had. You mentioned that you really enjoy being a bookseller. Is there any of that helps or feeds into your work as a writer? Maybe just simply the exposure to the books that you have as a bookseller or authors, or indeed when speaking to readers. Is there any sort of way in which it helps to be a bookseller first?
Well, I wasn't a bookseller first, to be fair. I was writing.
Yes.
Yeah, but not really. No, I mean, it's a customer service facing job. It's a customer service job, and that was the jobs that I did throughout my 20s, was in bars and cafes and Waterstones. So by the time I got to Waterstones, it was like I'd entered the promised land, like the other jobs were much worse. And it's just like, I was sort of walking around the shop being like, I can't believe you think this is work. This is incredible. Like, I get to talk to people about books. And that was probably my favorite part of the job. I mean, there is very little in the way of crossover between selling books to people and writing books, other than that you get to actually talk about books, which is always nice. And you also get to meet a lot of people who are interested in books, and that's pretty nice. There was this particular guy who used to come in on a Saturday. He was an Italian guy who spoke about 3 or 4 languages. I was in Belfast, like for work for a few months, and he used to come in and he would say, "Right, recommend me a book," and I had to just bring him up to the fiction section, just give him whatever book, and one of the first ones I tried to recommend to him was Bolaño. I was like, "You should read some Bolaño." I think the week before that he had read something like that, and he said, "I've read it in Spanish." And I was like, "Right, okay." Where this is okay, the bar's high. And so every week he would literally just walk in and go, "What am I reading this week, Michael?" And I would say, "Joyce." He said, "No, I've done it." It's just like, and it was a real challenge. But that was kind of one of my favorite customers. I remember recommending Lucille Berlin, and he really liked that. But no crossover at all. I mean, you don't get the rights when you're working. You're sort of just standing talking to people and selling books. Yeah, that's the.
we do discourage people from writing whilst working. It's true. I did think though that the HR department might be able to use your line. It's better than other jobs in their next hiring drive for bookselling.
Yeah. I mean, cleaning nightclub toilets is definitely a step down from working in books. That's
Good to have some perspective, I would imagine, definitely. And Nana, I'm going to come to you with a question from Fiona. She said that she loved the footnotes because they really grounded the book for her. But she wanted to know why why you had added those and whether the publisher was on board with that idea right from the start.
I've been very lucky that my editor, who represents the publisher, has never tried to make me not do something I really, really want to do. Or maybe I should rephrase that. The things they've told me not to do, I definitely shouldn't have done, and I didn't do them. But the footnotes were something they were cool with from the go, and I was grateful for that. But yeah, I included them because it's funny. If you would have asked me, I don't think I like footnotes usually. But I think that my aversion to them was that they kind of broke the fictive dream, which I sort of had been taught was really paramount. I read the John Gardner as a younger writer, The Art of Fiction, and his whole thing is never break the fictive dream. And footnotes sort of necessarily do that by just forcing your author moves down. But I think that tension almost became a challenge to me. Maybe if I can make footnotes that I like, they could be really engaging for a reader. And so I wanted them to be really dynamic as opposed to purely encyclopedic, as most footnotes are. And they operate in a lot of different ways. Sometimes they're elegiac, sometimes they are more information, sometimes they are other stuff I don't want to spoil. But they mostly do provide real life context. Sometimes I cite case law, sometimes I cite constitutional law, sometimes I cite things that the police or the carceral state has done in our lived world. Because I want it to be impossible to read this book as it's just about a woman with a hammer killing people. I know someone, or I met someone who was when Squid Game was out, and I was talking to him about it, and I was listening to him talk, and I was like, but it's about this capitalism, and he had watched the entire Squid Game and never thought about capitalism once, if you can believe that.
Yeah.
And so that feels terrifying, but that's a very obvious example. But there's a huge long history of poems and stories that we read, and over years they get the exact, not only a wrong reading, but almost the exact opposite reading. Robert Frost is an example with his poem. There's a lot of things that become almost sacred in literary canons and lose all their meaning. And so I basically wanted it to be impossible for someone, because it's a violent book that employs violence in a serious way. I wanted it that violence to always be tethered to this institution that I think is extremely oppressive. And that's probably the primary reason for the footnotes.
Fantastic. Well, as you have said that sentence, I've looked at my clock and realized that we have passed the hour mark. So I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I just want to say, I'm just going to grab my copies here. That for anybody who's listening or watching, that obviously this is a prize which is all about our booksellers identifying the new voices that excite them most. And so that means that whether you read one of these books or all 6 of them, it is just the beginning, because all of these writers here are people that you should be waiting with bated breath for them to publish book 2, 3, 4, and 5. I'm going to say them all by name. You can all take a little bow as I do this. So we have Wandering Souls by Cecile Pin, Fire Rush by Jacqueline Crooks, Close to Home by Michael McGee, In Memoriam by Alice Wynne, Carla by Colin Walsh, and Chain Gang All Stars by Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyar. I think I got them all right. Yeah, that's my contribution. Thank you, all of you, for joining me. It's been so fascinating to hear about all 6 books and to hear a bit more about what went into all of them. Best of luck to you all. There, of course, can be only one winner. But as they say, you're all winners here. Thank you once again.
Thank you.
Thank you.